Welcome to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversation series. I am Sherilyn Parsons. I am the founder and executive director of the Bay Area Book Festival. Tonight's special event, Coming Together When Things Fall Apart, Giving Voice to Emotional Truth in Our Times, kicks off our sixth annual festival. Typically, we would be doing this in person, but in these very unusual times, we've pivoted to bring you a world-class festival online. Literature is essential, especially in tough times, to sustain us, guide us through the storm, help us understand each other and our changing world. And that's what tonight's event is all about. We want to thank you for helping us weather the storm. Tonight is a fundraiser, and each of you viewing this live event has helped make it possible for us to keep bringing you literary conversations and programming on issues and topics that really matter. Our Unbound virtual programs run at least through the summer, and you can find the latest updates at baybookfest.org. I especially want to thank our 4 featured authors who have given their time to help us survive and thrive. Tonight's program brings together 4 of the most perceptive and resonant writers working today: Anthony Doerr, Danielle Evans, Kwon, and Viet Thanh Nguyen. Danielle will be our moderator. So I get to introduce Danielle, and she is going to introduce the other panelists. So Danielle Evans is the author of the story collection, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, great title, which won the PEN American Robert W. Bingham Prize, the Patterson Prize for Fiction, and the Hurston-Wright Award. Her new collection, the Office of Historical Corrections, is forthcoming from Riverhead. Danielle's work has won an NEA fellowship and has been anthologized multiple times in the Best American Short Stories. She teaches in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. And Danielle, please take it away. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Sherilyn. Thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to join tonight's program and to be speaking to our wonderful panelists, who I will introduce now. Anthony Doerr's 5th book, All the Light We Cannot See, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and was a #1 New York Times bestseller. His books have been translated into over 40 languages. He served as guest editor for the 2019 Best American Short Stories, and he's at home in Boise, Idaho, with 2 dogs, 2 sophomores in high school with smartphones, and some dudes a mile from his house in front of the State House with AK-47s and a DJ. Kwon's nationally best-selling first novel, The Incendiaries, is published by Riverhead and is being translated into 7 languages. It was named a Best Book of the Year by over 40 publications. Kwon's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, the Paris Review, Vogue, NPR, and elsewhere. She's received fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, Yaddo, and MacDowell. Born in Seoul, Korea, Kwon has lived most of her life in the United States. She is sheltering in place in the Bay Area. Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. His other books are The Refugees, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He is a university professor, the Errol Arnold Chair of English, and a professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. He's been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. His most recent publication is Chicken of the Sea, a children's book written in collaboration with his 6-year-old son, Ellison. So hi.
Hi there.
We're going to talk about all of the brilliant work that has won you all of these awards and recognitions soon. But because part of what's strange about this moment is our lack of human connection, I wanted to start with just a really basic human question, which is, how are you? What do your lives look like these days? And kind of what moments of grace or moments of difficulty are you finding in this kind of strangeness?
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for doing this. And your essay on the Sewanee Review blog site, The Corona Letter, was amazing. Beautiful. Amazing. Very moving essay. If folks want to look that up. I'm doing okay, I guess. Every hour is a different answer. Some days I'm able to just lose myself in work and forget about this world for 6 or 7 hours. And that's an incredible, immensely privileged gift. I know that. And then other days, we're trying to build a school from scratch for our kids, and I'm putting on a mask to walk in the grocery store, and I feel like I'm about to rob the place. And my wife's like, "You got to wipe this down. No, you got to wipe this down." And I'm washing my hands 300 times a day, and hearing from friends in Italy, and worried about them. And so, yeah, it's just every day you're just really, really grateful for everything around you. That's an incredible gift. I'm glad we have the room that we have here in Idaho. I feel very much for you folks that are in cities that don't have a big yard they can go play in. And I'm just happy to see other people, even if it's on my computer.
Hi, I'm Reese, and I'm so glad to be here. I don't know. I haven't been good, but I'm not terribly. I know I feel as though like I'm trying to sit with how I feel about things and do less to like dismiss how I'm feeling about things in the moment. But no, things don't feel good. But also I know how lucky I am. I'm in a place where I have like a room where I could write, which is a lot. I don't know. I think it's day by day what Tony was saying about going from day to day feels really important right now, and not looking ahead more than about 2-3 days at a time has been helping.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Danielle. Thanks for hosting us here. I actually feel pretty good, which makes me feel bad. I think what's happened during this time is that it's revealed both privileges and disadvantages in how we live our lives and how our society is structured. And what it's revealed for me is that I'm relatively privileged. I feel very lucky for the fact that my son is taken care of through online education with very competent teachers. I have a backyard. I rarely go out. I'm psychically equipped to live in isolation apparently for years, and it doesn't bother me too much. And my 6-year-old son is exactly the same, but he doesn't want to go back to school. And I was also very lucky that I finished the novel right before quarantine hit. So if I was still struggling to finish a book, I think I'd feel much worse. And that does, for a writer, that means a lot when you don't have to worry about writing as much. And I think what this period of time has taught me so far over the last month or month and a half is to be able to let go of certain things. I went into online schooling with my son with a very rigid schedule, and that has all gone out the window. Now he just does whatever he wants. And I think that's okay. And I think it's okay that I'm not writing every day. I think it's okay that I take time to do other things, like spend time with my family, and to think about, what the future should be for my writing, but also what the future should be for the literary world, but also our entire country as well.
I am going to ask our panelists some questions for about half of our discussion time, but I should say that if you are attending in the audience, you can use the Q&A function to share your questions, and Sherilyn will be sharing them with us in the second half of the conversation.
Danielle, how are you doing? Tell us how you're doing real quickly.
I'm okay. In some ways, I live in, I haven't really left my apartment, and I love my apartment, and it's kind of, I have everything I need in it, and I haven't had to go outside, which in that way makes me very lucky. But I also have been outside twice to take the recycling out in a month and a half, and live by myself. So it's fine until every 5th day when it suddenly isn't, and we start. Yeah, so and I guess all of us have shared a little bit about this in kind of public writing about kind of this piece, and I wanted to sort of check in about the quarantine essay as a kind of genre. All of you wrote lovely pieces about kind of what you've been doing or what you've been thinking about, and kind of what this movement is called to the forefront for you. There's been some interesting, because we're all on Twitter too much these days, discourse, backlash, sometimes about specific essays that made people upset, but sometimes just about the sort of fatigue of the genre of all of us who have time to write kind of being the people writing about this moment. But I think for me, as someone who also felt compelled to write about it, part of why I felt that way was I think Reese captured really beautifully in her essay that a lot of this moment feels like grief. And one of the things that sort of feels weighty about grief is silence and not being able to give voice to it, or feeling kind of like nobody wants to hear that. And so it can be useful to kind of find a language for the things we are grieving. I wondered if I could ask you what you felt compelled to kind of highlight or give voice to in your own writing about this, what you've read maybe that's been interesting or meaningful, either directly related or indirectly, that's sort of helping you think about the now?
Well, I think there's three kinds of essays I've seen. You know, the first one is the most detestable one, which is, look at me, I'm on my yacht. Or look at my view of the beautiful Pacific Ocean or something like that. And that's probably the least useful essay out there. But the other two I think have been very useful to me. And one is, you know, one of the things that Reese wrote about, which is how to deal with our own personal feelings, how to deal with our own grief, how to deal with our own isolation, and all the various terrible things that can happen, which are real. You know, it doesn't matter in that sense whether we're privileged or disadvantaged, or we all have to deal with our emotional states, and we all have to confront them. And I think that is something valuable. And the other set of essays has been about what do we do as a society. So, for example, Arundhati Roy's essay in Financial Times, I thought hit the note that I wanted to try to focus on as well, which is that this crisis that we find ourselves living in is, in her words, a portal to a different future. Now, that future can take place in many different kinds of ways. And it's up to each of us to try to figure out how to, you know, do our own little bit to shape that future. And I think that part has been useful. I mean, we have to examine ourselves individually, but we have to examine who we are collectively as well.
I love that so much, Viet. And I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I can see why there's some backlash against people writing about this, but I honestly I can see that, and I respect that some people feel that way. But I honestly feel as though, like, whatever's getting people through, man. Like, if it's writing about this, if it's reading about it, I am gobbling up every single pandemic dispatch. I'm reading every single article I come across about people who got sick and lived through it, people who took care of somebody. Like, I want to know what people are up to. I feel so hungry for the details of what this is and how people are experiencing it. And I think for me, it helps cut down on some of the anxiety the more information I get. So there's that. And I'm also just I miss people, man. I miss my friends. I miss hearing about people's lives. I miss eavesdropping at the bar on the date next to me. And I this comes as close as I can get, I think, to that kind of just what I miss the most is the rhythms of city life, I think, maybe more than I want humanity again. And this is how I'm getting it right now. And there is, I like how Viet categorizes the different essays. For me, at least, in writing about it, I was feeling just so blocked with my novel, which currently in theory is my first priority. But honestly, at this point, I feel okay if I can eke out one sentence in a given day, which is nice and all. It's no way to finish a novel ever before I die. And so instead I wrote about if I found that I could write about how I couldn't write. And that was one thing that was available. And it also meant something to write a piece that at least some people found helpful in any way. It helped me feel less useless, at least for a few days, which again is no small thing.
Yeah, for people who don't know, Reese's essay is beautiful about grief in the New York Times. It's maybe mid-April. I don't know if there's a way to throw links up there, and Viet had an amazing essay April 10th or something about how the narrative of this pandemic, we're not even close to the climax, and we have an opportunity to kind of determine the course of that narrative, and how, what do we do with these moments are so vital. It's going to explain, because we have so many pre-existing conditions as a society, and climate change is not going away. It's going to be an extremely hot summer, and cities where people are in their apartments, cities are going to have electrical grid problems. There's going to be all kinds of things that are still existing before the coronavirus pandemic. And so that's another amazing essay people should look at. I agree with Reese, finding these things is great. You just feel less alone. And so many times, not necessarily reading old novels, but reading things that were written recently, or watching TV shows where everybody's touching each other and everybody's hugging. It seems almost like from a former age. So occasionally, at least for an hour a day, reading stuff that's been written since March 10th is kind of it's reassuring. It feels like things are being made now.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask about that. Our next couple of questions are about fiction, and I thought we'd sort of, does anyone need us right now? Are fiction writers useful? But one of the things that's been strange is kind of work that's coming out now, and not just fiction, but television. A lot of art that's realist contemporary art suddenly feels very surreal, right? Because you're just standing at the screen don't do that. You can't leave your house. You can't touch people. And And it's kind of bizarre because obviously people didn't intend to be writing about the alternate future when they're like publishing books in 2020. And so I wondered if that is either as a consumer of art or as a writer kind of become a craft question. When you think about your next project, does it change kind of when you want to set it, or how you would think about writing about this period, or is that just too far off a question to even consider? I'm being told I should say who should answer the question first so that we don't have awkward pauses. So maybe Reese, do you want to take this one first, and then I'll start with Viet next?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I have been having this is the worst time I've ever had writing fiction in my entire life. It's so hard for me to get out even that one sentence, which is my requirement for myself. I'm like, if I wrote one sentence, then like I can let myself like go to sleep eventually during the course, like at some point. But I think I realized part of the problem for me is that I already know it's set before the pandemic. Like I've been working on it for 3 years. Like it's a work in progress. But I don't know. I'm not fully certain of the point in time from which it is being told. And I think I need to be super clear with that in my head, like exactly what year. Even if I never say so, I need to know from what point the book is being told because it's told in the past tense. So that question of tense is really interesting me. I think I've also been realizing I'm having a great deal of trouble like sinking in because right, like as I'm sure like everyone, all of you of course know, and I'm sure like a lot of people who are listening in also know, like, at least for me, like some of the greatest joy I know in the world, and definitely the greatest joy I know from writing is like those like incredible moments when I've completely lost all sense of myself, when I forget I have a body, I forget to eat, I lose all sense of time, like that's bliss. And I think my body is not inclined to let me do that right now, and I think it's because it feels like the world is so dangerous, and I'm like physically on alert. I want to know all the information. I want to know like what drugs are in trials, and so if I'm sinking out of my body, or like if I'm sinking out of myself, that means that I'm not being a guard for myself and my community, and so. I don't know. I think I like that's not a good way to write fiction, and I just need to like chill out somehow. I don't know what I'm gonna do. Maybe just like I live in California, like maybe just like more substance use. I don't know. More candles? I don't know. I don't even own candles. I could get a candle.
I think most of us became readers and writers not because of some instrumental purpose that we wanted books or stories to teach us a moral or something like that, but because we enjoyed the experience of language and of narrative and escape and fantasy. And that's exactly what's happening for me during this time. I mean, I'm just reading stuff and watching stuff that brings me pure pleasure. I am not trying to watch or read anything about contagions or pandemics or imprisonment or isolation or anything like that. And fortunately, as a reader, I've already read Jose Saramago's Blindness and Ling Ma's Severance. So it's not as if I haven't thought about some of these issues already. And with my son, who's 6 years old, we've begun reading the Harry Potter series just for fun. And I think millions of people all over the world are doing exactly the same thing. They're turning to TV series, to movies, to music, to stories to get away from the fact that they're stuck wherever they happen to be stuck. And so if there's one aspect of a bright lining for those of us in literature and the arts and so on, out of this is maybe the overwhelming majority of people will be reminded how crucial stories are to live, that you need these stories to feel things, to share experiences, and just to experience things that you can't experience with human beings all the time. So far as my writing goes, though, even though in my escapist part, I don't want to deal with isolation on that. And so far as my writing goes, I'm writing a nonfiction book that brings together all these things I've been thinking about over the last few years about my own memoir, my own history, but also what is the United States? What does it mean to be Asian American? What does storytelling mean? And that, I think, has been deeply affected by the idea of writing in the time of coronavirus, writing in terms of isolation. And that essay in the New York Times that Anthony referred to was a way of trying to think about that, like how it's impossible to separate what we're dealing with as writers from the nature of isolation, from the nature of our privilege or lack of it. And so I can't help but imagine that for this whole generation of writers right now, we're going to see some long-term ramifications in terms of how people write and what they write probably more so, ironically, than the impact that the forever war, for example, in the last 20 years has had on the majority of American writing. I think many Americans feel they can get away from things like the wars that we're fighting, but no one can get away from COVID and isolation, and that's just going to transform what's going to come out very soon.
I'm in a slightly different position because I was in New York City in October for an event, and I had a glass of wine with my editor and agent at lunch and told them I'd finish my novel by Christmas. And then I got on the plane home and was like, that was very, very aggressive and ambitious. I've been working on it for about 4 years at that point. Missed my Christmas deadline, and then I told them April 30th. And so then when Suzanne asked me to do this event, I'm like, oh, I'll be done. It'll be amazing. And I didn't hit that yesterday or Thursday, but now I've told them May 7th. So I've been writing. Some days I'm working like 11 hours a day, and I'm able to shut it out only by just sheer force of will. And thankfully, I'm not on social media. I had to delete the Washington Post and the New York Times from my phone because, just like Reese, I'm so desperate for information. There's this huge kind of swirling anxiety moving underneath me all the time, but I'm just trying to shove it aside. And I'm really, really grateful that I'm far enough that I was already kind of in the downhill of this novel that I feel like now it's just this act of building connective tissue and trying to figure out this thing that I was making. So mostly I think I'm just trying to get this done, and then I'll probably look up and start having more hour by hour anxiety. But I think it's kind of been a great gift to be able to do that disappearing that Reese is talking about. Usually I can find sometime in the day to disappear into a novel and then to disappear in my own work. I found since September 11th, then the re-election of George W. Bush, Katrina, then the election of Trump really hit me for a little while. And each time you have to kind of tell yourself, it's okay. Give yourself a little time to adjust to this thing. It's kind of like the first night you sleep in a hotel room, you don't sleep as well because it's all new to you. But the second night you're like, okay, I'm getting used to this place. And then of course you have to leave. But by the time you start getting a little more accustomed to things, that's usually when I can kind of turn on that compartmentalization power that I think a lot of novelists have, which you just start to disappear. And it does feel kind of indulgent to play with sentences and story all day. And there's times you feel like it might not be worthwhile. And there are people out there, when there are nurses out there risking their lives to go to work. But when Dave Chappelle did the monologue before the Saturday Night Live, right after Trump got elected, he read this little quote from Toni Morrison. She wrote an essay for the 150th anniversary of the nation. I looked up that essay the other day, and basically she said, she was feeling depressed after the re-election of George W. Bush, and a friend had called her and was like, pull it together. Like Solzhenitsyn wrote, like in prison, there are people that have written in incredibly dire circumstances, much more dire than I'm going through, or that she felt she was going through at the time. So it was kind of it's a cool call. It's a beautiful essay that she wrote. And anytime I start feeling like that, like what I'm doing doesn't matter, I find that essay and it kind of gives me faith to say, who knows? You're trying to make this thing and tell stories, and hopefully that can bring me some peace, and hopefully maybe a few readers some peace too.
I mean, fiction writers, in my experience, are often creatures of anxiety, even in the best of circumstances. That sort of if-then instinct that helps us write fiction also helps us move through the world, imagining every possible thing that could happen in every possible moment. Helps. And also we're often writing about people who have some sort of calamity happening to them, either it's an interior calamity. And so I wonder, do you feel like this maybe it's two questions wrapped into one, so you can answer either or both as you see fit. Partly, do you think that kind of the time you spend thinking about heartbreak, trauma, isolation as a writer has in any way prepared you for this moment, or made it easier to kind of, because we're constantly imagining the worst, does when things happen badly, do you feel more prepared or less prepared, maybe is the question. And I think the other part of that is, I mean, for me, and I know for many of you have written about the part of the sort of compounded tragedy of this is like, one, there's a pandemic and everything is terrible, and there's this sort of loss of human life and fear. And also, as with any kind of crisis, there are ways, the country kind of reminds people who it thinks belongs here, or who it thinks needs protection or who deserves to be safe, right? And a lot of you have written in your fiction about people kind of experiencing a kind of structural violence that exists independently of the actual crises that they're often also experiencing. And so I wonder, in the way that you sort of confront both of those kinds of trauma in your work, how you're thinking about that in this moment, how it's kind of brought to the forefront the questions you've already been asking as writers, or pushed you to think about these in new directions in what you're writing now or thinking about in the future. Maybe we'll start with Viet this time, sorry.
Well, COVID has obviously revealed that borders are insufficient in the times of global pandemics, and that we're all interconnected in many different ways. And I think in my own thinking as a scholar and as a fiction writer and as an essayist, that's always been the point that I've been trying to get to, that many of us deal with particular different specific kinds of issues, and it's easy to isolate these issues when really what we should also be doing, besides delving into the specificities of our issues, is to connect them to the larger ways in which we're all brought together. So I'll just give you an example, which is, I'm a Vietnamese refugee, came out of the Vietnam War. And when COVID happened, I was actually sort of well prepared for it because I never forgot the moment of crisis from which I came to the United States. So my house was actually mostly fully equipped with all the things you're supposed to have in terms of dire emergencies. So I didn't have to go run out and get toilet paper because I got like a 3-month supply already in my house. But thinking of myself as a refugee, I thought that the crisis that produced me and my family as a refugee was a historical crisis that was related to underlying, ongoing structural crises that have always defined American history and world history. And that what privilege means for many people is to pretend that they're not living in a crisis. If you feel comfortable and safe, you have a house, you have food, all that kind of stuff, you think everything's okay. That doesn't mean there's not a crisis going on. And so what COVID reveals is that there's been a crisis going on in American society that people could not pay attention, did not have to pay attention to. But now it's revealed that so many people can barely make it paycheck to paycheck, and they can't afford health care, et cetera, et cetera. Now that, I think, is the work that I was always interested in, that if I was going to write about, for example, being an Asian American, I didn't want to write simply about what it meant to experience discrimination or anything like that. I wanted to connect the Asian American experience to everything else that was happening in American society. So lo and behold, we have COVID and we have anti-Asian racism happening at the same time. It's a perfect example of how you can't isolate one crisis from another. They're all waiting there. They're all structurally connected by the inequalities that are deep and ongoing in our society, so that it's easier to blame Asians or China for COVID than it is to blame structural inequalities in American society for how poorly equipped we are to respond to a pandemic like this. So that's how I approach the crisis as part of a much larger crisis, how I hope that my own fiction and nonfiction can try to bring these things together. And again, I'm hoping that more writers, as they pass through this moment of COVID, will start to see the same kinds of connections.
I love what you all are saying about this. I think something that really helped me, and I'll just say this in case it's helpful to anyone to think about this kind of reframing. I think I was also, up until like a couple of weeks ago, I was really struggling with the question of like, on the one hand, I'm not sure I'm all that interested in general in questions of relevance, and that I think like fiction, poetry, nonfiction, literature has always felt so relevant, like regardless of how my personal life is going or how the world seems. That said, I wanted to know how my novel could help someone like me in this particular position right now feel any better, or like not even feel better, but like how it could even feel alive, how this made up world could feel alive to someone in this kind of circumstance. And I think I was having trouble with that, especially since I've been having a lot of trouble reading fiction, which has never happened to me in my entire life, and it's been extremely destabilizing. But I think what I realized was like, so I write a lot about grief and about what happens when you lose something that was so central to your life that your life no longer feels like the same life. And a lot of that has to do with how I grew up extremely Christian, and I lost that when I was 17. And in a lot of ways, I'm always writing about that. But then it occurred to me that like I had that happen. So maybe in a very different way than what Viet had. I had a world that was intact and it had its own rules. And then I lost all of that. And like, essentially, and it was gradual. And then it was one day, and then I lost all of that. But you know, like, and I was so broken by that. Like, I honestly felt, I don't say this very often, but I'm just going to say it again in case it helps. For like a solid year, I really wasn't sure how to keep living. Like, it was just so hard. But then I did, you know, for years and years and years. That happened when I was 17. And there's been so much joy and so much life and so much goodness since then. And I think to the extent that that is interesting to me, that's something that I can write about in my fiction. And then suddenly it feels less irrelevant. Suddenly it feels less like, what the fuck am I doing making up these characters when there are people like out there actually just like literally saving lives every day, and all I'm doing is really struggling to make up characters and like make up a world. But if I can hold on to that idea that it's not foolish, it's not irrelevant, it can matter. Literature has saved me 100 times over, 1,000 times over. I don't even know. And that helps a great deal. About the structural inequalities, about oh man, on that front, I honestly don't know what to add to what Viet said, except I am moved and heartened by all the ways in which like people are really caring for one another, are being community minded, are helping one another, looking out for their friends and neighbors and communities, and I think that feeling of being heartened, I want to preserve in my fiction too.
I think the current global political movement towards nationalism is about isolationism. It's about building walls. And if you're a lifelong reader, as I expect many of the folks tuning into this are, reading is always training your imagination to leap. Even though you're spending a lot of time by yourself when you're reading, ironically, what you're learning to do is be able to transcend the self and enter other minds, other places, other times, other worlds. And that's even at the sentence level. When you come to a beautiful simile in Danielle's work, that simile on a micro level is teaching you to leap to an unexpected place, a place you didn't expect to go in that sentence. And in terms of story, that's what you're doing. You leave your own world and you believe in another existence that's made with these little black marks on a white page. And the structural inequalities baked into our system are about division and forgetting and focusing on people who look just like you or live right around in your same neighborhood, or it's the suburb. It's the drop the garage door and go in your house and don't get to know your neighbors. And literature is always teaching to expand that. So I feel like in some ways it equips us maybe with that anxiety and that sensitivity that you're talking about, Danielle. But the other side of that is that you are a little more prepared for this moment because it's ridiculous. This isolationist mythology of like this one lone Caucasian male against the world can turn his back on NATO and we don't have to have any partnerships and, we can do it America first. That's absurd when you're tweeting that with a phone that has parts from 270 countries inside of it. So there's pollution over California from China. We're all in this together. And so maybe in some ways the coronavirus teaches us this lesson, like your idea of these walls is totally absurd.
Okay, I'm going to ask our panelists one more question and then start taking some audience questions. So if you have a question, please start sending it. Use the Q&A function, not the chat function, if you want to submit a question for the authors. So Tony, in your essay, you wrote about I don't know if you're still doing it, but you said you were like documenting like a square in your yard every day, that you were just kind of going out and checking on the same spot and kind of observing. And that seemed like a really kind of lovely ritual that was about both stillness and writing. And I wondered if I could ask either if all of you have been able to develop either rituals about writing that help you stay grounded, even if it's not a specific project, or if you've been given yourself permission not to write right now, other kinds of rituals that have allowed you to take in the place of writing, but allowed you to kind of be present in the world in some way that's been meaningful to you.
Yeah, sure. I can go first. I think Reese mentioned this in her essay. We're used to, in these strange jobs we have, we're lucky enough to get to move around a lot. And I also wrote for Travel Magazine for a long time. Like I'm just used to a kind of lifestyle where in the beginning of my writing career, I was taking a job in a different state every year. So, we moved a ton when our kids were little. And so I think I mentioned in that essay, Danielle, I think last spring I was home 27 days in all of April, May, and June. So to have this time is ironically been a real gift. I understand that's an enormously privileged thing to say, but to be able to sit and see spring flow into the high desert where I live and not have to go do anything else has been this incredible gift. So I'm just trying to tell myself, you don't publish it, you don't show it to anybody, it's just for yourself. Just write some lousy sentences every day where you move yourself out of your head and pay attention to the world around you. Even if you don't know the names of the creatures you're looking at, just witness spring. And I think, that's been a way to kind of keep the anxiety at bay for me.
I love that so much. I love this thought of witnessing the spring. That's so beautiful. I agree with, in terms of the schedule, right? Like I was realizing I've slept in the same bed as my husband for 2+ months. That has literally never happened. And there are ways in which I'm trying to notice that. I'm trying to notice what that is. And like, to be honest, like what would I want to do if I had 10 days left to live? I would want to read and write and spend time with the people I love. And at least I get a tiny bit of that, And as I've said, I've been having a great deal of trouble reading fiction. I can't overemphasize how destabilizing that is. Like it's like I would 100% rather pick, if I had a desert island choice of writing and reading, I would absolutely pick reading. Like I would still feel super sad about the writing being gone, but the reading, that's what I absolutely need. But I can read poetry right now. Not that I couldn't before, but poetry seems almost somehow more available to me right now than prose. So fuck it. I'm just going to read a lot of poetry. And I agree with like writing what I can write right now. So I'm very drawn to writing. So my characters were just like, they were just at an all-night party and like touching each other a lot. There was like a lot of like, I don't know. It was like a raucous party. That was great. And then I was going to write a scene in which like 2 people were hanging out together. I was like, no, what I want to write next is like, I'm going to skip ahead to the wedding scene. There's going to be a lot of dancing. People are moving around and I'm putting all my longing, or my writing is going best right now when I put my longing for things and for people and for experiences into my work. And so if I'm like, God, I fucking need, like, what I want right now is a mosh pit. Like my body wants a mosh pit. I've never been in a mosh pit. Like it's not anything I wanted, but I badly want like a mosh pit all night rave is what my body wants. And it's like, okay, so I'll use that energy with my writing right now. And so that's been one thing that's helped a lot.
Well, I think as writers, we should all forgive ourselves. The whole idea out there that we should write every day is sort of a stick that we use to beat ourselves. And I think the reality is that you do have to write a lot to become a writer. Let's just pick Malcolm Gladwell's figure of 10,000 hours, which is probably true for me. But you don't have to do 10,000 hours in a certain amount of time. You can, as long as you do 10,000 hours, eventually you become a writer. And likewise with the books that we're writing now or the stories that we're writing now, whatever we're doing, the reality is we're going to have a lot of time to work on these stories. I just read an article in the New York Times with a scientist who predicted the pandemic. And she said, we're actually being really over optimistic, thinking that this will be done in 12 to 18 months, more like 36 months. So if that's the case, just take it easy, write a little bit whenever you can. And if you do that over 36 months, lo and behold, you'll have a book. So that's sort of my take on things. And outside of that, little rituals that I'm developing to keep myself sane are around reading and drinking, the 2 most important activities in my life outside of my family. Reading, I have an Excel sheet. I've been very systematic. And with all this extra time, I can be very clear about mapping out my reading. And I've done like 29 books since January. So this is like the best reading I've done in a very long time in all kinds of genres. And in terms of drinking, I'm trying to have a cocktail every day and learning a new skill as a bartender. So I think all of us should try to learn a new skill. And it doesn't have to be socially productive or good for you or anything like that. It could be bad, and that's fine. I had myself a Sammy Tucci Negroni right before this event. And after this is finished, I'm probably going to have another drink as well.
Cheers. All right. Let's take some audience questions. Sharon, do you have an audience question for us?
Yes, I sure do. There have been a lot of questions coming in, and so one comes from Allison, and I think we're going to augment that with a couple things that other people have been asking on top of her question. So she asked Tony, she is halfway through reading All the Light We Cannot See when we were ordered to shelter in place. Reading about navigating extended home confinement, as in the book, and other entrapment was oddly comforting. Have Marie-Laur's and Werner's stories been top of mind for you lately? And are you handling your own isolation the way you imagined you might? And then I want to expand the question a little bit to the others. You know, in most fiction, it's like something really significant has happened that has destabilized the writers, or I'm sorry, destabilized the characters. And of course, that's what's happening in our entire society. So how have you, what have you learned sort of from your characters? What was it like writing them in this destabilizing time? And similar to the question to Tony, how are you sort of reconnecting with those characters, or how do they now influence how you're coping?
Thanks for the question, Allison. Yeah, it's a good question. They are on the top of my mind, but once you finish a book, often, then a year passes before it comes out, and then you talk about it in front of crowds for a while, and then, those characters are in your past. However, I have been thinking about this character in the novel. Marie is stuck in her apartment with her weird uncle, and she's reading Jules Verne. She's reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in Braille. And so I have been thinking a lot about what Viet was saying about, this is a time to read, and how unbelievably lucky we are to still have book deliveries. Of those of you who can download books, or my kids are listening to tons of audiobooks, to have access to that is such a gift, and, try to take that for granted every day. And I've noticed that I'm pulling books off our shelves. I sometimes get sent a lot of books. And so, I wrote reviews of science books for the Boston Globe for 10 years. So I got tons of science books sent to the house that I never even opened. So it's been really nice to go through our existing library and see what's in there. And sometimes pick up a book that, you bought 10 years ago and haven't opened. And so I do think about her experience reading during her stay-at-home period, much scarier period than we're going through right now, but and how reading can be a world inside of your world, and entering another world, whether it takes you directly out of your life or it's something you can relate to. It's really, I think, healthy. It helps you.
Jason, Viet, did you want to jump in on that, or should we take another audience question?
Well, I was thinking about how, at the end of my novel, The Sympathizer, the last 3 or 4 chapters are all set in a re-education camp, and then ultimately in an isolation chamber. So, and as I was writing that, those 3 or 4 chapters, I had to try to imagine what isolation was like, in much more punishing circumstances than what we're undergoing now. And on the one hand, the actual experience of isolation is terrible, especially the kind of torture that I was talking about. On the other hand, writing about it was fantastic. I had a lot of fun. So, how do you use art to how do you use art to imagine? How do you use art to make a connection with the reader? How do you use art to construct a whole new world, even if that world is something terrible? And so, from the perspective of a writer, as I look at what we're going through, I'm actually, part of me is actually happy in a weird, perverted way, because it just means there's more to write about eventually in the end. And as pleasurable as the experience of reading and viewing stories can be, there's also something pleasurable about the challenge of trying to use your art to confront something very difficult as well.
I love that so much. And I think there is something about the, both of what you were saying about, I think there's something about the pleasure of naming, the pleasure of, pleasure is not even the right word. It's like deep soul satisfaction that comes of being able to put words to something, and having that it's like one of the best feelings in the world, I think. And yeah, there is something really remarkable about experiencing something that feels this strange to my body, and this strange to my mind, and then seeing what kind of words I can put to that. I love that so much. Thank you.
And maybe less intentionally a directly topical way. I mean, you also write in your novel, Reese, about a community, or people have just kind of decided what they're going to believe and committed to it, right? And I've been thinking a lot about that lately, about sort of people sort of, there's a subset of the population that seems to believe that if you just don't believe in the virus, like it can't harm you, right? And there's something, I don't mean to equate that with faith, but there's like a destructive kind of belief in things that you can just decide that you have, to the point of like harm to your own person or community. Just sort of thinking about that question in your novel help you frame how you're thinking about now, or does it feel unrelated to you?
This is such a beautiful question. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. You know what, something that's been helping me a lot in terms of just being less angry. I'm not at all opposed to anger. I think I prefer anger to a lot of other, prefer anger to sadness. It gives me energy at the very least. But it's making me a little less angry to think about all the research I did into cults and all the time I spent trying to understand what would make somebody join a cult. Because I mean, like Fox News and the Republican Party at this point, like it's a death cult. It's a death cult. And when people are in cults, it is very difficult to reason with people in cults. If you fall into a cult, it doesn't mean you're past, you exist beyond the reach of empathy, sympathy, and like recognition as a human being. So anyway, just telling myself that every time I open the news, like these people people who are behaving in ways that to me seem utterly monstrous, they're also in a death cult. I don't have to wish every single person dead who is in their death cult. Like they also are, it's trapped in a terrible ideology. And on the other hand, like I'm also exhausted by like calls for empathy for our oppressors. Like I'm tired. I know a lot of people are tired. It just helps me feel better. That's
Sherilyn, can we take another question from the audience?
Yeah, let's see. There are so many questions, which is fantastic. So I guess there's a couple from Hannah who has asked, given the extremely difficult time that all of the authors I've heard from are having reading and writing right now, how do you think any new literature will come out of this pandemic? How long will it take before we can write about the world we're living in now?
Well, honestly,
I can weigh in and, I can just say that I'm not. I mean, it's taking me a little more psychic energy to break through my morning anxiety about like what's the latest and what's the death count and what's the confirmed case count. But then I'm writing, and I feel like in many ways the work feels a little bit more urgent and more relevant. So at least one voice out here can say that I hope in some ways I'm being a little more productive. I had, I think, 4 events in April canceled that I would have had to fly in an airplane for. So that carbon's removed from the atmosphere, potential carbon. And I probably got maybe 7 or 8 more days of writing in than I would have otherwise. So in some ways it's more productive in my experience.
I don't think we have a shortage of writers. It's not going to be a problem. So even if COVID stifles 10% of the writers out there, the rest of them are just going to be like, I have a book, publish me instead. But I think of the New York Times essay that I wrote. One of the things I brought up was that isolation and imprisonment, as terrible as they can be, can also be transformative experiences for people. It helps them to see themselves, helps them to see their world in totally new ways, seek out new kinds of education and all of that, and can produce new writers. And so we can look at traditions of prison literature that have come out of these experiences. I don't think that there's going to be a shortage of people trying to make sense out of the isolation that we're undergoing. How long that's going to take is a question, but actually I think that the literary response to this will probably be a lot faster than the literary response to 9/11 or the literary response to the wars that we've gone through. And partly because there can just be so many more people who will have directly experienced this. And I think we're all just waiting for a chance to try to just get a little mental distance from this before we start writing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I just read, I think it was published within the past week. The poet Ada Limon published a really powerful poem in the New Yorker that like directly had to do, I don't know if it was about this pandemic, but it was about something related. And it just, like reading it felt like having a really delicious drink that I haven't been able to have this whole time. Like it really, really helped me. I loved reading it. I read it over like 10 times. And honestly, like I'm so excited not excited. That's a fucked up way to say this. I want to see what people are going to do. I know there's going to be literature about this. I know people are going to write about it. I know people are going to like it might be like 10 years from now, there's going to be something that like really tells me a lot about what we're going through. And yeah, that part I don't feel the least bit discouraged about that, I think.
Yeah,
we have the immense luxury of not working in a collaborative art. I mean, I think I feel so much for friends in television or friends in theater that it's so much more challenging to make work right now. So in many ways, we're extremely lucky that we do a solitary art form.
I've been thinking, I think we've been trying to solve as fiction writers for a decade the sort of problem of how to represent communication on the page when it's happening through kind of technology, right? That we haven't quite, people have done brilliant jobs of it, but I don't think there's a consensus about like how and when do we represent that something in a conversation happened via text message, or what's the difference between an email and a letter? And I'm wondering how people will make sense of, whether we'll just pretend this never happened and kind of do the sort of vaguely fuzzy timeline novels where we missed the sort of year that all of our personal conversations happened on Zoom, or whether we'll sort of invent some kind of form to contain the way that we're talking to each other now. I'm kind of curious to see what comes out of that. Charlotte, we have so many questions. I don't want to take all the time talking. So could we take another audience question maybe?
Yeah. Let me just pull this up. So there have been several questions about that you've all talked about sort of what writing you're reading now that's been solace. I mean, Reese talked about poetry. So several people have asked what has really been helpful to you as you've been going through this.
I can't say enough about Natalie Diaz's new collection called Post-Colonial Love Poem. It's incredible. Like every single poem is bringing fresh discoveries. It's just so alive. It's so full of like love and rage. It's very interested in structural inequalities in the U.S. It's very interested in the sort of like the gift that love is, that human love is, and sex and joy. And anyway, I just can't recommend it highly enough. I've been just reading one poem a day, and I'm actually already kind of really distressed that the poem that it's a book of poems. It's really short. It's going to run out. But
I actually also read Post-Colonial Love Poems, so I can endorse that as well for all those reasons. And honestly, there's nothing I'm reading right now that is not helping me deal with this, because again, part of the experience of reading is simply transportation to some other place than where I'm at. So I'm listening to Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, very entertaining novel. I am reading Sigrid Nunez's The Friend, very entertaining novel as well. I just read Mira Jacobs' Good Talk, which seems perfectly relevant to try to make sense out of our age. I am also trying to, figure out questions around decolonization that'll be relevant to my nonfiction books. I'm reading a lot of stuff dealing with colonization and Native Americans and indigenous people. And that would include David Troyer's Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, as well as Natalie Diaz's poem, and Deborah Miranda's Bad Indians. And that's, I think you take advantage of this time in isolation to get a deeper understanding of something, as well as engaging in fantasy and escape. So this is part of my project, is try to understand another aspect of American history that hasn't gone away.
I've been reading this, The Travels of Ibn Battuta. Has anybody heard of this book? He's like, when we're in school, we're talking about Marco Polo, and he's done some amazing journey, but I wrote it down. He left in 1325. He's kind of the Marco Polo on steroids of the Islamic world. He left for 29 years. He went 75,000 miles. And the journal is pretty amazing. It's so moving. The hospitality he finds, he does run into bandits here and there, but for the most part, it's been such a reminder of the immense hospitality, whether he's in Muslim countries or Christian countries. He's almost always given food, given a place to stay. He stays there for long periods, months sometimes. He's meeting kings. the details of like the rich melons he's eating in 1330. I miss travel, and I just love that so much that, you think of the Middle Ages as this like dark and cruel time, but this is really a book about hospitality in many ways and how guests were received. And, I think about how so many of us will walk past a homeless person and, why aren't we bringing those people into our homes and feeding them? And what have we lost, over the centuries?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of contemporary things that I just hadn't had a chance to, that are sort of grounding and a kind of just giving me some place to be outside of my own head way. But I'm preparing for my fall class, which is about the passing narrative. So I've been rereading and taking notes on sort of very early American literature that we start with there. Also, I remember just about a year ago, almost exactly, I was doing a not Zoom Q&A with Tommy Orange. And for some reason, because I like to ask uplifting questions, asked him something about the apocalypse. And he said, well, natives are already post-apocalyptic people, right? Like the apocalypse already happened and we're still here. And I think about that a lot when I'm sort of reading early slave narratives, which is like the apocalypse already happened and we're not all dead yet. So there's something, even though it's a strange thing to feel uplifting, there's something about kind of in a period of grief and in a period of seeing like how many people are going to die and how many of them are going to be people who are vulnerable, people who have already been sort of told they're not valuable, about kind of understanding. And I don't mean to say, because obviously not everybody lived through those periods, right? I don't mean to sort of say, and we'll make it through, because we won't all make it through. But I do think there's something grounding about recognizing how many times the world has ended for various populations, and how many ways we sort of figured out how to rebuild. Can we take, I think we have time for at least one more, maybe two more audience questions, and then I'll ask a final question.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Definitely two. There's so many questions. So there's a couple that I want to make sure we get in. Following up on really what you were just talking about, how, people, actually Susan asked this question. After 9/11, everyone said, okay, this is going to totally change writing, right? Literature, et cetera. And, in some ways it affected how people wrote, but in many ways not. And do you feel that this will change storytelling, literature, poetry, et cetera? And I think that I'm just going to add a little bit too, and getting back to Viet's earliest comment about how this pandemic is really showing up, the many lies, the many, hidden things from the power elite, it's becoming apparent, the inequalities and so on. Do you think that the things that this pandemic is showing in our society is going to affect literature going forward?
The reason why I think 9/11 didn't have that great of an impact on American literature is because the United States is a military-industrial complex built on waging war perpetually. So most Americans don't want to confront that. That's just a normalized aspect of their experience. It's a background hum of their lives. And even had something as horrifying as 9/11 was more like a disruption rather than a fundamental change in how Americans experience their reality. What we're going through is I think is quite different. I mean, if we're talking about unemployment numbers of like a 25% unemployment rate, we're looking back to the Great Depression, which did transform the way that Americans wrote. It did transform American politics. I mean, we're looking back at a time during the Great Depression when socialism was a possibility, where writers were getting militant. And by militant, I mean nowadays, of course, many writers are politicized to the extent that they are Democrats or they tweet about kinds of things. But I don't think a lot of writers are politicized in the sense that they actually let their politics affect their aesthetics. Whereas during the Great Depression, you did see a transformation of the American literary landscape in terms of what writers were writing about and how they were writing about it. And you did see formal experimentation in the work of writers like John Dos Passos and his USA trilogy, which were and are still radical formally. So I do think that just the sheer size and impact of the economic devastation that's going to be wreaked by COVID, which is affecting writers right now, which is putting people out of work, including creative writing professors, that's going to have an impact on how writers conceive of their writing and themselves in relationship to all the various institutions of American society.
Tony and Reese, did you want to jump in there, or should we move on to another question? Okay, maybe let's take the next question, Charlotte.
Okay, so several people have asked about what these writers are working on next. And Danielle, it would be great if you could chime in too, because I know you have a new book coming out and you probably already also have something else underway. So, and also, do you feel that you will, I mean, who knows, right? But if you'll be able to write about this pandemic or how you see that it might affect your own work longer term, but just in the more immediate term, what is ahead for you now?
I can give our panelists a break and start, and then we'll pick on them. Yeah, my collection is still coming out in November, so we'll see what kind of book tour world looks like in November, and also what else is going on in November. It'll be an interesting month. Yeah, I mean, the title, everything is either set before. Obviously, it's either set in the past, mostly the recent past, or the title novella is set in the sort of near future, but in an alternate near future that was already an alternate near future, which I'm sort of relieved that I don't now have to sort of figure out how to think about where this fits into that world. I've learned one lesson about being a writer in like 15 years, and that is to not talk so much about my work in progress. So I do have a work in progress. I'm on teaching leave this semester, so in some ways, it feels like this is kind of what I'm supposed to be doing until I can't leave my house. Like, I don't realize that something is happening until I turn on the news, but I've been trying to find my way into that project and kind of thinking a lot about, I was already on the fence about whether it was set in the summer of 2019 or the summer of 2020. And part of me is like, just put it in 2019 because it doesn't really matter for what the story is. And part of me is tempted to just throw the whole project out and sort of start playing with like what would happen if it was set in this time, which is probably a terrible idea and I probably won't do. So I'm going to get to the end of the 2019 draft before I consider whether to kind of throw it in the air and trap everyone in the house. How about you guys? Maybe Reese, do you want to start?
Sure. So I've been working on a novel for, I keep saying 2.5 years, but I think honestly I'm lying to myself, and I think we're now at 3. But so my first book took 10 years. So all I've been telling myself, not all, but like I really want my second book to take like 6 years, not 10. But we'll see. But it's about 2 women. They're both artists. One is a dancer, one's a photographer, and the photographer becomes professionally and then romantically obsessed with the dancer. And I think it is changing sort of what I'm focusing on with the book. I think I'm letting myself, well, I don't know if this applies to everybody who's here, but for me at least as a fiction writer, I tend to run toward the trouble, like I get really anxious if my characters are just like sitting around feeling good about life, like that just tends not to happen. In grad school, my husband once was just like, why do you never write anything happy? And I was like, that's not fiction, it's happy. So, but to like try it out as like a formal test for myself, or like a content test, I guess. I wrote a story. I titled it "Happy Story," and then it just stayed blank. Like I think it's still on my laptop somewhere, just like an empty story about happiness. But I think right now, given how shaky and threatened so much feels, I'm letting myself stay more with the sweetness, with the human love, with people like really enjoying each other. I'm letting myself stay there a little bit more, being a little less quick to run toward the hardship and the trouble and the like buildings blowing up. They're not blowing up in the second novel. They blew up in the first novel. As far as I know, because yeah, it's such a miracle, right? Like I think I'm like feeling increasingly awed by the miracle of love and like community and like people like trying to be there for one another. And I think that's a miracle that's absolutely worth spending more time on in my fiction.
The book was supposed to deliver yesterday, and hopefully will deliver next Thursday. Is it's set in the past, the present, and the future. Big chunk of it's set in the 15th century, and it's about miracles too. It's about books and how unbelievably fortunate it is that we have anything written from before Christ. And so I'm trying to somehow tell a story about libraries and how these big moments in time now in the information age or whatever we call it, and at the time of the printing press and this event in the future that I won't go into until you read the book, how are stories told? How do they last? Why do certain stories get allowed to last, to persist, and move the reader, kind of build a puzzle in the reader's mind as I move back and forth between those time periods?
Well, as for me, I finished the sequel to The Sympathizer right before the quarantine hit. It's titled The Committed, and it was supposed to come out in October, but COVID has pushed it back to March 2021. So I've got nothing to do for the next year except to try to figure out what else to write. And as I mentioned, I'm trying to write this nonfiction book based on all these op-eds I've been doing over the last few years and all these speeches I've been giving over the last few years as well. And it's a whole mess. It's just like me and my family and being a refugee and the war and America and storytelling. So I have no idea what it's gonna be by the time I'm finished with it.
Danielle, this is Sherilyn coming in again. Can you hear me? There was just another question that there's been some buzz in the background here, but people wanting to know if before you close, if we could just interject. There's been some questions about how the writers stimulate or invest in their own creativity when they can't vary their daily environment. And a lot of people were sort of persisting on that one. So I wanted to make sure we got it in before you moved into your own closing questions, if that's okay.
Well, I could say something that helps me a lot and often tends to help other people, I think, is to not forget that the more I can keep in mind that I exist in a body and that my body has a lot to do with how I'm engaging with the world, the better off I tend to be. And so, for instance, I participated in like a Zoom dance party a couple weeks ago that a friend organized. It was one of the only times since it started that I felt an unmitigated joy, like a joy that was not, it did not feel like a compromised hangout in which I was like, oh man, I would so much rather be with these people in person. There were ways in which it was actually better than being in a crowded bar with somebody with like the DJ refusing to play Robin and like, and like crowdedness and sorrow and like the drinks are too expensive. Like there are so many ways in which it was actually better. And so since I understood that the dancing lifted my spirits, I've been trying to dance every day, like just like one song for like, and then I feel better. And like that like shakes me out of whatever headspace and reality I'm in at that moment. And it puts me in a new one in which perhaps I'm more open to the possibilities that have to do with writing, especially writing fiction.
Well, I mean, for me, the way I avoid writer's block is that I always have multiple writing projects going on. And if something is not working, I just do something else. So even when I was writing my novel, I'd be writing op-eds and or short stories and whatnot. And now that I finished the novel, I've turned to the nonfiction book, but I'm still writing op-eds too. And in the background, while I'm writing these op-eds, I'm also thinking at a low level about something more creative, about the next novel. I mean, this will be a novel after they're committed. And so I think that's really crucial. Like, if you only have one project, if you only have the one story that you're writing, one novel, and you're going through a hard time with that piece or because of other things like COVID that's affecting your life, it's going to be very hard to be creative, potentially. You can be trapped, not just with yourself, but with the one piece that you're writing. And so for me, it's been really crucial to know that I can turn to do something else. If the creativity is not flowing in one way, I'll just write something else. And with the faith that eventually I'll be able to go back to that other creative project.
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. For me, the answer weirdly has been plants. I feel like, maybe I live at a more northerly latitude than a lot of folks listening, but to see the change, I'm learning like I didn't have to go to Istanbul to be infused with new experiences. They're going on right outside the door. And if you're living in an apartment and you don't have access to a yard, if you just throw dirt in an old Frisbee and set it outside, things will happen in that Frisbee. And you might actually find yourself totally engaged by the journey of a weed as it comes out of your Frisbee. So I think I'm learning, like, just slowing down and paying attention to these things. It may not directly affect the project I'm writing, but you do feel like you're having a new experience. I mean, the lesson of coronavirus, the lesson of life is change. Change is the only music. And to watch it at a much smaller, more humble level, it still is a way to see the world and to pay attention. And you have this bell of mortality dinging. You know, we live in the flight path of the life flight to the hospital. It's these helicopters are really the only things in the air right now going over the house. And you know, you hear that buzz in the background, but you're also seeing like spring come to life. And there's something been really moving about that for me, and I'm learning a lot in this experience about how much newness and change there is around me. I don't always have to go seeking it out at a far distance.
Okay, and maybe speaking of change and transformation, we'll sort of transition into our last question, which is, in your op-ed, Viet, you closed by sort of, after talking about the challenges of this moment, with a hope that isolation might also give us time to kind of reimagine the things that are clearly failing us right now. Is that perhaps this isolation will finally give people the chance to do what writers do: imagine, empathize, dream. What are you imagining or hoping for kind of to come out on the other side of this? What would be a vision for something we could sort of learn and live in a slightly better world when we're able to live in the world again?
Well, I mean, my imagination fluctuates on the spectrum between dystopia and utopia. So it goes both ways. You know, the dystopia is pretty easily imaginable, that things can get a lot worse in terms of authoritarianism and war and Americans turning against each other and all these terrible things that we're already seeing some hints of. But the utopian part in me thinks about how we already have the ideas that we need to transform our society, that we've had moments of opening in the past. I mentioned the Great Depression and sort of the radicalization of everyday Americans that was taking place back then. But we already have, you know, predecessors. We already have people arguing for things like Medicare for all, for a social safety net that could guarantee a universal basic income, for higher taxation. None of these things are so fantastic that they're science fiction. I mean, they're things that we could actually implement in terms of policy and things that we can demand. That doesn't mean they're easy to do, given the state of partisan politics in this country. But that's my utopian moment. Just trying to imagine that if a quarter to a third of the American people were out of work, they'd be angry for sure, but maybe they'd also be reaching not just for demagogues, but for solidly thought out ideas and agendas that would help them and us just transform how we live.
Something that I can imagine happening, although of course it could swing the other way, is I wonder if I feel as I see people around me letting go a little bit more of the appetite, hunger, and need for certainty. And that's something that I'm always interested in my work, especially as somebody who grew up so religious, believing one set of things, and then just like abandoned all of that. And I think that hunger for certainty is both very human and extraordinarily dangerous. And that's part of what 45 offers, is what demagogues offer, is certainty. And I keep seeing people around me being like, well, you know, like, I don't know the answer to that. Like, I have to go read about it. Like, I think I see people being more comfortable saying, I don't know enough to have an opinion about this. I don't know enough to know what to do about this. And I don't know if more of us could let go of the need for certainty, then maybe there would be less absolute. Then maybe there might be less dogma. Maybe there might be less less of the death cults.
That's beautiful, Reese. I need to work on that too. I'm always looking. That's why I think I'm so hungry for information. I'm always looking for some certainty, some idea of the future. Like Viet, I feel like my imagination can swing. Like in the space of a shower, I'm swinging between dystopia and utopia. But the one thing that I thought when you asked that question, Danielle, is the humanization of scientists. I feel like there are a lot of kids out there right now who are seeing scientists as human. And maybe that's a really good thing. This idea that, because science, they're not magicians with white coats. Like, they're just people. You're failing almost all the time, but you're just trying to investigate something in a rigorous way and figure it out. And that's so human. That's so interesting. That's what we evolved to do. And so, with the search for a vaccine, when you think about like the end of World War I, when everybody goes out in the streets and the bells are ringing, the fact that there's all these people who look different, who speak different languages, collaborating with these incredible technological tools to try to figure out this disease and understand it, and that children are watching that unfold is really exciting to me. And I hope that it inspires a lot of people to realize, like, oh, I can be a scientist. I don't have to be some genius who's getting perfect grades in math in sixth grade. Like, you just have to be interested in things and investigate things.
Okay. Thank you all so much for this conversation. And thank you to the audience for joining us and for your support of this fundraiser for the Bay Area Book Festival. After this talk ends, on the screen you'll see a link where you can find the festival's independent bookstore partners, where you can buy our speakers' books and have them shipped directly to you. And again, this has been a really wonderful evening and conversation. Thank you all for joining. I'm Danielle Evans, and you've been watching Unbound, Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. Good night.